After 5 years missing in a war zone, a Navy SEAL finally returned home with the loyal K-9 who had never left his side. He expected his mother to run into his arms, but the farm was abandoned, the house was falling apart, and she looked 20 years older. When he smiled and said, "Mom, I'm home," she stared at him in fear and asked, "Who are you?" Then she raised a shotgun, convinced the stranger wearing her son's uniform had come to steal her land. To stay near her, the Navy SEAL hid the truth and became a tenant in the bedroom that still held his childhood memories. But when dangerous men returned to seize the farm, one familiar act of courage began awakening the memories she had lost. Where are you watching from? And what would you do in his place? Please like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers and inspire more heartfelt stories. The road into Raven Creek stretched beneath a pale autumn sky, carrying Lieutenant Elias Rowan toward the place he had imagined every night for 5 years. Elias was a 33-year-old U.S. Navy SEAL with a disciplined athletic build, an angular rugged face, and a sharp jawline that had grown harder during the years he was missing. His clean-shaven face revealed faint scars near his left temple, while his cold blue-gray eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had learned to sleep lightly and trust silence more than promises. His dark hair was cut into a neat modern undercut, with tightly faded sides and a short textured top, almost exactly as it had been before his final deployment. He wore a complete green digital camouflage uniform, properly buttoned and fitted, with a plain black belt and black combat boots. There were no medals on his chest, no tactical vest, no weapon, and no signs of ceremony. Elias did not feel like a returning hero. He felt like a man borrowing someone else's life and driving toward a home that might no longer belong to him. Beside him sat Atlas, the only living companion who understood what the journey had cost. Atlas was a 5-year-old male Belgian Malinois with a lean, muscular body, a deep fawn to mahogany coat, and a sharply defined black mask covering his muzzle and part of his face. His upright ears shifted at every distant sound, and his dark amber eyes remained focused even when his body appeared relaxed. A narrow scar marked the edge of his right ear, left by a piece of flying metal during their last year in the mountains. He wore a tan tactical K-9 vest and a plain working dog collar. Atlas was obedient without being mechanical, protective without unnecessary aggression, and unusually sensitive to changes in Elias's breathing. Whenever Elias's hands tightened around the steering wheel, Atlas turned his head and watched him, as though silently checking whether the man who had survived beside him was still present. 5 years earlier, Elias had left the Rowan farm before sunrise to join a rescue operation in the isolated Kandar Valley. The mission was supposed to last 6 weeks. An armed faction had trapped several families between 2 shifting battle lines, and Elias's team had been assigned to establish a safe path for evacuation. The night before his departure, his mother, Margaret Rowan, had stood beneath the light above the farmhouse door and placed a white handkerchief in his palm. She had sewn a small blue letter E into one corner. Her fingers were strong then, roughened from years of farm labor, but she had held his hand as gently as when he was a child with a fever. "Don't lose it," she had told him. Elias had smiled. "I'll bring it back." Margaret had looked directly into his eyes. "I don't need the handkerchief back. I need you to bring yourself back." He had promised her he would. The promise broke in the Kandar Valley. A sandstorm had rolled across the mountains on the 3rd night of the evacuation. Swallowing the road and reducing visibility to a few feet, Elias's convoy was attacked while moving 6 children and 2 injured teachers toward a temporary medical station. During the confusion, Elias and Atlas became separated from the rest of the unit. Elias refused to abandon the children, even after an explosion tore through the rear of the vehicle and drove a piece of metal into his side. One of his teammates, Petty Officer Owen Mercer, was wounded worse. Elias used Margaret's handkerchief to apply pressure to Owen's injury. Earlier that day, Elias's identification chain had snapped while he was climbing through a damaged building. He had placed one of his identification tags in Owen's jacket for safekeeping, intending to repair the chain when they reached the medical station. They never reached it. A second explosion struck before dawn. When the recovery team arrived days later, they found the burned remains of a vehicle, Elias's identification tag, and the white handkerchief embroidered with the blue letter E. The remains inside could not immediately be identified. Based on the objects recovered and the position of the wreckage, the military concluded that Elias Rowan had died during the attack. But Elias had been thrown into a dry ravine nearly 30 yards away. Atlas found him beneath broken branches and loose stone. Elias would later remember brief pieces of those first 2 to 6. The dog's warm body pressed against his chest during the freezing night, the rough scrape of Atlas's tongue against his face, and the sound of barking that continued long after Elias had lost the strength to respond. Atlas eventually drew the attention of villagers from a hidden mountain settlement. They carried Elias into an underground storage room, removed the metal fragment, and treated him with the limited supplies they possessed. The battle lines changed before Elias could recover. Roads were destroyed, radio towers collapsed, and armed patrols began searching nearby settlements. The people who had saved him would have been punished for sheltering a foreign soldier, so Elias remained hidden. Weeks became months. Months became years. He moved between isolated communities, helping reinforce shelters, escorting families through mountain passes, and teaching local volunteers how to avoid unexploded devices. Atlas stayed beside him through every relocation. For nearly 4 years, Elias existed outside official records. He had no functioning radio, no safe route to Allied territory, and no way to send a message without exposing the people who had protected him. When an international aid organization finally opened a humanitarian corridor, one of its doctors recognized the military-style surgery scar on Elias's shoulder and began questioning him. His identity was eventually confirmed through fingerprints and dental records. Returning to his own country took many more months. Elias underwent surgery, physical rehabilitation, psychological evaluation, and formal interviews about his disappearance. Military officials began correcting the report of his death, but Elias asked them not to contact Margaret until he could understand exactly what she had been told. Records showed that the official notification had been delivered 5 years earlier. After that, her medical and financial information became difficult to access without legal authorization. Elias made a choice that now seemed painfully foolish. He decided he would go home himself and explain everything face to face. He did not want another uniformed stranger appearing at Margaret's door with another official envelope. He wanted the first words she heard to be his own. 20 miles outside Raven Creek, Atlas suddenly rose from the passenger seat and pressed his nose against the side window. The dog released a low, uncertain whine, a sound Elias had heard only twice before, both times when Atlas had detected someone familiar after a long separation. Elias slowed the truck. On a distant hill stood an old wooden billboard, painted with a faded advertisement for Rowan Valley apples. His mother had once laughed at that sign because their family had never grown apples, yet tourists always stopped at the farm asking to buy them. Atlas stared at the billboard, then turned toward Elias and placed one paw against his arm. For one irrational second, Elias wondered whether Atlas remembered the road. Or perhaps the dog sensed what Elias had been trying not to admit. They were not simply going home. They were driving toward the answer to a question Elias feared more than anything he had faced in combat. Had his mother survived losing him? Elias continued driving, but the sight of the old sign released a flood of memories. He remembered Margaret after his father died, standing alone in the barn with unpaid bills spread across a workbench. Elias had been 9 years old. He had watched her cry for less than a minute before she wiped her face, rolled up her sleeves, and went outside to repair a broken fence herself. She had never allowed grief to become an excuse for surrender. She worked the fields during the day and repaired neighbors' clothing at night. Her brown hair began turning silver before she reached 50. Her hands developed deep cracks from winter cold and farm chemicals. Yet every morning, Elias found breakfast waiting on the table. During the hardest year, their kitchen sometimes held only a loaf of bread, 4 eggs, and 1 bottle of milk. Margaret always placed 2 eggs on Elias's plate and claimed she did not like eggs. She poured him a full glass of milk and said adults did not need as much as growing boys. Elias believed her until he was old enough to recognize hunger in another person's face. He also remembered her rules. Shoes came off before entering the house. Milk bottles had to be closed properly. Basketballs belonged outside, no matter how cold it was. Lies had to be corrected before bedtime because, according to Margaret, a lie left overnight grew roots. The lesson Elias remembered most came after he fought 2 older boys who had been tormenting a smaller student. Margaret had cleaned the blood from his lip and listened to the full story without interrupting. "You were right to protect him," she had said, "but never enjoy hurting someone, Elias." Strength is not making people afraid of you. Strength is having the power to hurt them, and choosing only what is necessary to keep someone safe. Those words had followed him through every deployment. As the truck entered Raven Creek, familiar buildings appeared in altered forms. The old feed store had become a pharmacy. The diner where Margaret once worked weekends was boarded up. New houses stood where open fields had been. Elias felt like a ghost passing through a town that had continued living after burying him. Atlas remained upright, watching the road. Then Elias saw the weathered wooden marker. Rowan Farm, 1 mile. His breath caught. He lowered one hand from the wheel and touched the folded replacement handkerchief in his chest pocket. The original had been lost with Owen, but Elias had carried the memory of it through the mountains. "We're almost there," he told Atlas. The dog's ears moved forward. Elias turned onto the narrow farm road, expecting the familiar line of white fencing, green pasture, and the spinning windmill beside the barn. Instead, dead weeds brushed the sides of the truck. The road had narrowed beneath years of unchecked growth. Several fence posts leaned at sharp angles, and strands of rusted wire sagged into the grass. Elias reduced his speed. The fields were nearly barren. Dry earth showed through patches of yellow grass. The irrigation ditch was clogged with leaves and mud. One side of the barn roof had collapsed inward, and the doors hung unevenly from their hinges. He stopped the truck before reaching the house. For several seconds, he could not move. The brick path Margaret scrubbed every spring had turned green with moss. Vines covered part of the porch. Paint peeled from the exterior walls in long gray strips. A section of the garden fence had rotted and fallen, leaving the vegetable beds buried beneath weeds. The old windmill stood motionless against the sky. Elias looked toward the wooden sign at the entrance, needing to confirm what he already knew. Rowan Farm. This was his home, but it looked like a place where no one had lived for years. A cold pressure formed beneath his ribs. During the journey, he had imagined Margaret standing on the porch, older but healthy, perhaps dropping a basket when she saw him. He had imagined surprise, disbelief, and tears. He had never allowed himself to imagine an empty house. "If the farm looks like this," Elias whispered. He could not finish. He opened the truck door and ran. Atlas jumped out behind him, moving swiftly across the broken path. Elias reached the porch, stepped over a rotten board, and knocked hard. "Mom?" No answer came. He moved to the front window and wiped dust from the glass with his sleeve. The living room beyond it was dim. The old blue sofa remained against the wall. His father's clock still stood near the fireplace. Framed photographs rested on the mantel beneath a layer of dust. Then something moved near the far window. A thin elderly woman sat in a wooden chair, knitting a pale blue sweater. Her shoulders were wrapped in a cream-colored wool shawl. She wore a faded blue-gray dress beneath an old beige-brown cardigan. Her silver-white hair, once thick and shoulder-length, had been gathered into a loose, low bun. Her face had become narrow and deeply lined, and her hands trembled slightly as she worked the needles. Elias stopped breathing. Even after 5 years, he recognized the shape of her hands. "Mom!" Relief moved through him so suddenly that his knees weakened. He lowered his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. She was alive. Elias returned to the porch, set his backpack beside the door, and straightened his uniform. He rubbed dust from one sleeve, adjusted his collar, and tried to control the shaking in his hands. He wanted her first sight of him to be reassuring. He wanted to look like the son she remembered, not the wounded man who had spent years trying to find his way back. Atlas stood quietly beside him. Elias smiled through the tears, gathering in his eyes, and knocked gently 3 times. The knitting needles stopped inside. "Who is it?" Margaret's voice sounded thinner than he remembered, but it was unmistakably hers. Elias remained silent. A small part of him wanted to surprise her, to see her open the door before he said the words he had rehearsed 1,000 times. "Who's out there?" she called again. Footsteps approached slowly. A lock turned, followed by the scrape of a chain. The door opened. Margaret Rowan stood before him, small and fragile beneath her cream shawl. Her faded blue-gray eyes examined the uniform, then his face. Elias laughed once, unable to hold back his tears. "Mom, I'm home." He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her. Margaret did not move. Her body became rigid against him. Elias slowly released her and searched her face, expecting disbelief to turn into recognition. Instead, fear entered her eyes. She backed away from him and whispered, "Who are you? Who are you?" The question struck Elias harder than any explosion he had survived. He remained on the porch with his arms lowered, staring at the woman whose face had carried him through 5 years of darkness. Margaret Rowan stood only a few feet away, yet the distance between them felt wider than the mountains that had kept him from home. Her faded blue-gray eyes moved across his clean-shaven face, his green digital camouflage uniform, and the black combat boots on the porch, but no recognition appeared. There was only fear. "Mom," Elias said softly. "It's me." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. "Don't call me that." Elias felt Atlas shift beside him. The Belgian Malinois remained still, but his upright ears angled forward, and his muscular body became tense beneath the tan tactical vest. The dog was not reacting to anger. He was reacting to Elias's breathing, which had become shallow and uneven. Elias forced himself to slow it. "My name is Elias Rowan." The color drained from Margaret's face. "No. Yes, I'm your son. My son is dead." The words came without hesitation. They had been repeated so often, perhaps to doctors, officials, neighbors, and to herself, that they no longer sounded like a belief. They sounded like a wall. Elias took one careful step forward. There was a mistake. "I survived Kandar. I was trapped beyond the lines, but I came back." Margaret recoiled. "Stay where you are." She looked past him toward the old truck, then toward the damaged gate as though expecting other men to appear. "Did Blackridge send you?" "I don't know who Blackridge is." "You expect me to believe that?" Her voice sharpened, but beneath the anger Elias heard panic. The woman before him was not simply confused. She had been frightened before, repeatedly. Margaret pointed a trembling finger toward the road. "You people already came here, pretending to help. One of you said he worked with veterans. Another said he had papers from the county. Now you come wearing that uniform and using my son's name." Elias looked down at the uniform he had straightened only minutes earlier. He had imagined it would reassure her. Instead, it had become evidence against him. "Mom, please. Look at my right hand." He raised his palm, showing the narrow scar beneath his thumb. "I got this when I was 12. I lost my house key and tried to climb through the kitchen window. The glass broke. You wrapped my hand in a dish towel and made me promise never to lie about what happened." Margaret's gaze flicked toward the scar. For a moment, something changed in her face. Her eyes narrowed, not with suspicion but concentration. Her lips parted as if a name had risen somewhere behind them. Then the moment vanished. "You found that in a file," she said. "Or Samuel told you." "Samuel Reed. You even know his name." Elias's stomach tightened. Samuel was alive. At least that was something. But every fact Elias offered only seemed to confirm Margaret's fear. She began closing the door. Elias reached out instinctively, stopping himself before his hand touched the wood. "Please don't shut me out. I've spent 5 years trying to get back here." Margaret's expression hardened. "My Elias spent his life helping people. He was not a liar. He was not a thief. He wore that uniform because he believed this country was worth protecting." Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice rose. "He died doing his duty, and men like you come here to use his sacrifice against an old woman. I am Elias." "Stop saying that." The force of her cry startled birds from the roof. Atlas moved closer to Elias's leg but did not make a sound. Margaret's grief poured through her anger. "My son was an honorable man. He gave his life for people he never met. He protected this country, and what did this country give me in return? A folded flag, a box with no body, bills I could not pay, strangers asking me to sign away the land he grew up on." Elias felt his throat close. He had imagined his mother mourning him. He had never imagined the practical cruelty that followed. The bills, the empty rooms, the men at the door. Margaret stepped back into the house. "Leave. I can prove who I am." I said leave. She turned and disappeared into the dark hallway. Elias remained on the porch, listening. A cabinet door opened somewhere inside. Metal scraped against wood. Atlas gave a low warning sound. Margaret returned carrying an old 12-gauge hunting shotgun. The weapon had belonged to Elias's father. Elias recognized the worn walnut stock and the pale scratch near the trigger guard. Margaret held it awkwardly, the barrel shaking between them. Atlas moved half a step forward. "Stay," Elias commanded. The dog froze instantly, though every muscle remained ready. Margaret looked at Atlas, then back at Elias. "Take the dog and get off my land." Elias slowly raised both hands. He had disarmed stronger opponents in confined rooms. He could have crossed the distance before Margaret properly raised the weapon. But she was not an enemy. She was a frightened woman defending the last thing she believed still belonged to her. And she was his mother. Her own lesson returned to him with painful clarity. Strength was having the power to hurt someone and choosing only what was necessary to keep them safe. Elias stepped backward. "All right, Keep moving. I'm going. He backed down the porch steps without turning away from her. Atlas followed at his left side, matching each movement. When Elias reached the truck, Margaret was still standing in the doorway. The shotgun rested unsteadily against her shoulder, but tears covered her face. Elias opened the passenger door for Atlas, then walked around to the driver's side. Before getting in, he looked at her one last time. "I'm sorry I frightened you." Margaret did not answer. He drove down the farm road slowly. In the rearview mirror, he watched her remain beneath the porch light until the trees blocked the house from view. Only then did Elias pull onto the shoulder and stop. For several seconds, he sat motionless with both hands on the wheel. Atlas leaned across the center console and pressed his muzzle against Elias's shoulder. Elias closed his eyes. "I came back too late," he whispered. Atlas remained against him. "No," Elias corrected himself, though he was not sure whether he believed it. "I came back. That has to mean something." Atlas suddenly lifted his head and stared through the rear window toward the direction of the farm. A soft whine escaped him. Then, with deliberate care, the dog placed one paw on Elias's chest, directly over the pocket that held the replacement handkerchief. Elias removed the folded cloth and looked at the blue letter E stitched into its corner. Atlas sniffed it once, then turned again toward the road behind them. Elias remembered the old belief Margaret had repeated whenever he lost something as a child. "What belongs to you remembers the way home even when you don't." He looked back toward the invisible farmhouse. Perhaps memory worked the same way. Perhaps some part of Margaret still knew he had returned, even if fear had buried the path between them. Elias started the truck and drove toward the western edge of Raven Creek, where Samuel Reed had lived for as long as Elias could remember. Samuel's small house stood behind an old veterinary clinic that had been closed for years. The clinic sign still hung above the entrance, its painted image of a horse faded by sun and rain. Elias knocked. The door opened slowly. Samuel Reed was 72 now, taller than Elias remembered but thinner, with a slightly stooped back and a long, weathered face. Short silver hair framed a receding hairline, and a neat gray beard covered his jaw. His warm brown eyes had always made frightened animals calmer, though grief had deepened the lines around them. He wore a light brown plaid shirt beneath a dark olive-knitted cardigan, dark brown trousers, and worn leather shoes. A plain wooden cane supported his left side, the result of a hip injury from being kicked by a frightened horse years earlier. Samuel had once been known for his patience with every living creature in Raven Creek. Age had not changed that gentleness, but it had made him slower and more cautious. He looked at Elias for several seconds. The cane slipped from his hand. "Elias?" This time, hearing his name felt like being pulled out of deep water. "Yes, sir." Samuel touched Elias's face with one trembling hand. "My God." Then the old man embraced him. Elias stood rigid for an instant before returning the embrace. Samuel's shoulders shook. "I attended your funeral," he whispered. "There was no body, no, only a photograph, a flag, and a sealed box of belongings." Samuel stepped back, still holding Elias's arms as if afraid he might disappear. "How are you alive?" Elias gave him the brief version. The wrong identification, the villagers, the blocked routes, the humanitarian corridor. Samuel listened without interrupting. Atlas sat near the doorway, observing the old man. When Elias finished, Samuel looked toward the road. "You went to the farm." "She didn't know me." Samuel closed his eyes. "I hoped someone would stop you before you reached her." "What happened to my mother?" Samuel led Elias inside. The house smelled of tea, leather, and old medical books. Photographs of horses and farm families covered the walls. One framed picture showed a much younger Samuel standing beside Margaret and Elias at a county fair. They sat at the kitchen table while Atlas lay beneath the window. Samuel explained that Margaret had refused to believe the first report of Elias's death. She kept the porch light burning every night and prepared an extra plate at Sunday dinner. When the final death certificate arrived months later, she collapsed in the kitchen. Doctors diagnosed stress-induced cardiomyopathy, often called broken heart syndrome. The sudden weakening of her heart caused cardiac arrest. Although the medical team revived her, her brain had been deprived of oxygen long enough to damage areas involved in memory and recognition. She also suffered what the neurologist called dissociative memory loss, Samuel said. The physical injury and the trauma became tangled together. What does that mean? She remembers skills and routines. She knows how to cook, knit, dress herself, and find her way around the farm. She remembers that she had a son. She remembers that he became a soldier, and she remembers being told he died. but she can't recognize me. Samuel shook his head. In her mind, her son exists in fragments. Sometimes you are a boy. Sometimes you are a young man leaving home. Sometimes you are only a name connected to a funeral. The face standing in front of her today does not fit any single memory she can hold. Elias stared at the photograph on the wall. Why is she living alone? She is not entirely alone. I visit every morning. A community nurse named Clara Mendez checks on her 3 times a week. Clara is patient, practical, and one of the few people Margaret trusts. Neighbors bring meals. We installed alarms on the doors and removed most dangerous medication. Elias thought of the shotgun. Not everything dangerous. I locked it away last year. She found it. Samuel sighed. She remembers where your father hid every spare key. He explained that Margaret had once been moved to an assisted living center, but she stopped eating and repeatedly tried to return home. She kept saying that if you came back and found the house empty, you would believe she had abandoned you. Elias lowered his head. Samuel continued, telling him about Blackridge Financial Services. After a storm damaged the barn and water system, Margaret took a legitimate repair loan. Blackridge later purchased the debt, added questionable fees, and claimed the entire farm had been pledged as collateral. Its representatives repeatedly pressured her to sign new documents. They once sent a man who claimed he worked with a veterans charity, Samuel said. That is why your uniform terrified her. Elias looked toward Atlas. How do I make her believe me? You don't force her. She is my mother, and she is ill. If you keep telling her that the son she buried is standing in front of her, she may feel that you are attacking the only reality she understands. Elias rose and paced toward the window. So I stay away? Samuel studied him. No, but you must let her meet you before you ask her to remember you. Elias turned. What are you suggesting? The upstairs room is still empty. Margaret needs money, help with repairs, and someone nearby at night. Clara and I can tell her you are a former serviceman looking for temporary lodging. You want me to lie to her. Use your real name. Do not deny who you are, but do not demand that she accept it. Samuel leaned forward. Let her know Elias Rowan as a stranger first. Let her decide whether she can trust the man standing in front of her. The memories may follow later. Elias looked at the old photograph again. Margaret's younger face shone with pride beside the boy he had once been. And if they don't? Samuel's answer was quiet. Then you love her without being remembered. The words settled heavily in the room. Elias looked down at Atlas. The dog had spent years beside him without needing explanations, proof, or promises. Loyalty had never depended on memory. It depended on staying. Elias picked up the handkerchief and folded it carefully. When do we go back? Samuel retrieved his cane. Tomorrow morning. Clara should be there, and this time Elias. Samuel met his eyes. Do not go back as the dead son asking to be recognized. Elias nodded slowly. Go back as a man willing to earn his way through the door. The following morning arrived beneath a low ceiling of gray clouds. Elias stood beside Samuel Reed's truck with Atlas at his left side, watching a thin mist settle over the road leading back to Rowan Farm. He had slept very little. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret standing in the doorway with the shotgun trembling in her hands. Worse than the fear in her face was the certainty behind it. In her world, her son was dead, and Elias was only another stranger trying to steal something from her. Samuel climbed carefully into the driver's seat, favoring his injured hip. Before starting the engine, he looked at Elias through the open window. Remember what we discussed. I remember. You are not going there to prove anything. Elias glanced toward the farm road. I'm going there to ask permission to stay. You are going there to let her say no if she wants. The distinction mattered. Elias nodded. Atlas jumped into the back of the truck, his tan tactical vest brushing against the seat. The Belgian Malinois sat upright between the 2 front headrests, alert but unusually quiet. His dark amber eyes moved from Elias to Samuel as though he understood that the morning's mission required a different kind of discipline. They stopped first at a small community clinic near the town square. A woman was waiting beneath the awning with a canvas medical bag in one hand. Clara Mendez was 40 years old, of average height, with a balanced, practical build and warm light brown skin. Her straight black hair reached her shoulders but was tied into a low ponytail, keeping it away from an oval face marked by calm, dark brown eyes. She wore navy blue medical scrubs beneath a light gray clinical jacket and plain white medical shoes. Nothing about Clara was dramatic. Her strength showed in the way she listened before speaking, and in the quiet authority with which she handled frightened or confused patients. Years of caring for elderly people who could no longer fully trust their own memories had taught her that kindness without patience could still become a form of pressure. Clara entered the truck and looked at Elias. Samuel told me what happened. Elias expected sympathy. Instead, she asked, "Did you touch her after she told you to stop?" "No." "Did you try to take the gun?" "No." "Good." Her answer was not praise. It was an assessment. "She may remember your face from yesterday as a threat," Clara continued. "Today, you need to give her control. Do not step into the house until she invites you. Do not answer questions for her. Do not correct every inaccurate thing she says. She believes I'm dead. I know. How am I supposed to stand there and listen to that?" Clara's expression softened slightly. "By remembering that her illness is not a rejection of you." The words did not ease the pain, but they gave Elias somewhere to place it. When the truck entered the farm, Margaret was already outside. She stood beside the broken garden fence, wrapped in her cream wool shawl over the faded blue-gray dress and worn beige-brown cardigan she had worn the day before. Her silver-white hair was gathered in the same loose low bun. A wicker basket rested on one arm, containing several small jars and a bundle of dry herbs. She looked thinner in daylight, and the pale skin of her face showed faint age spots along the cheekbones. Her hands trembled when she set down the basket. Margaret's gaze moved from Samuel to Clara. Then she saw Elias. Her body stiffened. "No." Samuel opened his door but did not approach her. "Margaret, we are not here to force anything. You brought him back." "I did. I told him to leave." Clara stepped out slowly, leaving the medical bag in the truck so she would not appear to be beginning an examination without permission. "May I come closer, Margaret?" Margaret considered the request, then gave a small nod. Clara stopped several feet away. "The man's name is Elias Rowan," she said. Margaret's eyes flashed. "That is my son's name." "Yes, he stole it." Elias felt the accusation like a physical blow, but Clara had warned him not to rush forward. Clara kept her voice level. "He says it has always been his name. You do not have to decide today whether you believe anything else." Margaret looked at Elias. "What does he want?" Elias answered from beside the truck. "A place to stay for 1 week." Margaret gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You think I will let a stranger sleep in my house after yesterday?" "No," Elias said. "I think you have every reason to refuse." The answer seemed to confuse her. Samuel pointed toward the damaged porch roof. "The support beam is splitting. The west fence is down, and the water pipe near the barn is leaking again. I cannot safely repair those things anymore. I can pay someone." "With what?" Margaret asked bitterly before Samuel could answer. "Blackridge has taken nearly everything." Clara spoke gently. "Elias is willing to complete the repairs in exchange for temporary lodging. Samuel and I will check on you every day. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, he leaves." Margaret looked toward Atlas. The dog had remained beside the truck, neither approaching nor staring directly at her. When she looked at him, Atlas lowered his head slightly and turned his body at an angle, a calm gesture that made him appear less threatening. "What about the dog?" "He stays with me," Elias said. "It wears military equipment. It is only a working vest. Does it bite?" "Only when commanded in a serious emergency. I will not give that command here." Margaret studied Atlas for several seconds. The dog sat. Something in her expression softened, though only briefly. 1 week, she said at last. "Not because I trust him." Samuel nodded. 1 week, and no one touches my son's belongings. Elias's throat tightened. "I understand." Margaret lifted her basket and walked toward the house. She stopped at the porch and looked back. "Well, are you going to stand in the yard all day?" Elias took that as permission to follow. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of old wood, dust, dried lavender, and something faintly sweet simmering in the kitchen. The living room had changed little, but time had settled over everything. A crack ran along one wall near the ceiling. The blue sofa was covered by a faded quilt. His father's clock had stopped at 3:17, though Elias did not know when or why. Margaret stood at the bottom of the staircase. "You will sleep upstairs." Claire remained in the living room while Samuel took a seat near the door. Elias followed Margaret at a respectful distance. Atlas stayed downstairs until Elias quietly gave him permission to follow. The second stair creaked exactly as it had when Elias was a teenager. Margaret glanced back. "My son used to avoid that step when he came home late." Elias almost smiled. "Did it work?" "No. I heard him every time." She opened a door at the end of the hallway. Elias stepped into his childhood bedroom and forgot how to breathe. The room had been preserved like a place waiting for someone who had simply gone out for the afternoon. A narrow bed stood beneath the window. His old basketball jacket hung from a hook behind the door. Photographs covered one wall, Elias at 17 beside Margaret. Elias with his first military unit. Elias kneeling beside Atlas when the dog was younger. Several service medals and certificates were arranged with careful precision. Dust lay on the desk, but the frames had been wiped clean. Margaret placed folded blankets on the bed. This was my son's room. Elias looked at a photograph of himself in uniform, younger and unscarred. You kept it well. He was coming home. The answer was so immediate that Elias turned toward her. Margaret stared at the wall, not at him. People said I should pack these things away. Samuel said I could do it when I was ready. You weren't ready. I did not want him to think I had erased him. Elias lowered his gaze before she could see the tears forming. Margaret's voice became firm again. You do not remove anything from the walls. You do not open the desk drawers. You do not wear the jacket. You do not sleep in the bed with dirty boots. Elias looked down at his polished black combat boots. Yes, Mom, and the dog does not sleep on the bed. Atlas stood beside the doorway, ears upright. He won't. Margaret looked directly at Atlas. You hear that? Atlas lowered himself to the floor. Margaret blinked. At least one of you listens. As Margaret turned to leave, Atlas suddenly rose and walked toward the old desk. Elias nearly called him back, but the dog did not jump or paw at anything. He simply lowered his nose to the bottom drawer and released a quiet whine. Margaret froze in the doorway. No dog has been in this room since he left, she whispered. Atlas sniffed the drawer again, then looked at Elias. Margaret stepped closer, her guarded expression changing into uncertainty. That drawer is locked. Elias knew what was inside. Years earlier, he had kept Atlas's first puppy collar there, along with a photograph taken the day the young dog was assigned to him. Atlas could not possibly remember a scent sealed away for years. At least, that was what reason told him. Margaret touched the desk but did not unlock it. My son's dog used to sit exactly there, she said. Elias looked at Atlas, then at the drawer. For the first time since returning, Margaret was not looking at him as a threat. She was looking at him as part of a question she could not answer. The moment passed when a kettle whistled downstairs. Margaret withdrew her hand. Do not open it, she repeated, then left the room. Elias remained beside the desk. Atlas leaned against his leg. You remember more than either of us, Elias murmured. The week began cautiously. Elias repaired the porch beam first because it posed the greatest danger. Margaret watched through the window while he worked, frequently checking that he had not entered rooms without permission. Clara returned that afternoon to examine Margaret's blood pressure and organize her medication. She explained to Elias that predictability would matter more than emotional revelations. Do the same things at the same time, Clara said quietly while Margaret rested. Ask before moving her belongings. Tell her where you will be. A person with memory loss may not remember your explanation, but the body remembers whether someone feels safe. Elias followed the advice. Each morning, he told Margaret which repairs he planned to complete. He knocked before entering, even when the door was open. He never asked whether she remembered him. On the second day, he repaired 3 sections of the garden fence. On the third, he cleared the clogged irrigation ditch and temporarily sealed the leaking pipe near the barn. Margaret remained suspicious, but her questions changed from, when are you leaving, to, will that repair survive the winter? Atlas progressed more quickly. At first, Margaret placed a bowl of water outside. Later, Elias discovered a piece of cooked beef in it. When he asked about it, Margaret denied putting it there. Perhaps the dog found it. In an empty bowl? Dogs are resourceful. That evening, Margaret sat in her wooden chair, winding yarn into a ball. The strand slipped from her fingers and rolled beneath the sofa. Before Elias could move, Atlas crossed the room, lowered his head, and carefully retrieved the yarn without biting through it. He placed it at Margaret's feet and stepped back. She stared at him. Good dog. Atlas's tail struck the floor once. Margaret bent down and touched the top of his head. Her fingers trembled against the short mahogany fur. My son once said dogs never abandon the people they love. Elias, kneeling beside a broken cabinet hinge, kept his eyes on the screwdriver. He was right. Margaret continued stroking Atlas. Did you know him? Elias paused. Yes. Her hand stopped. Were you in the military together? In a way. Margaret seemed to sense that more was hidden in the answer, but she did not press him. Instead, she returned to her knitting while Atlas settled beside her chair. The following morning, Elias entered the kitchen after inspecting the barn. Mud clung to the soles of his boots. He took 2 steps across the floor before Margaret's voice cut through the room. Elias, take those filthy shoes off! Silence followed. Elias turned slowly. Margaret stood beside the sink, holding a dish towel. Her face had gone pale. You called me Elias. That is your name. You said it as though... I know how I said it. She looked toward the muddy footprints, then at his face. For a few seconds, her eyes searched his with painful intensity. Elias did not move closer. Margaret pressed one hand to her temple. I used to say that to someone. To your son? I don't know. The confusion frightened her. She turned away and gripped the counter. Elias immediately removed his boots and cleaned the floor without another question. Later, he opened the refrigerator, drank from a bottle of milk, and placed it back without tightening the cap. The mistake was unconscious, a habit preserved more faithfully than he would have believed. Margaret found it minutes later. She held the bottle in both hands, staring at the loose cap. My boy did this every day. Elias stood across the kitchen. Did he ever learn? A faint smile touched her lips. Never. For the first time, they laughed together. It lasted only a few seconds, but Elias carried the sound upstairs with him that evening. As the light faded, he stood inside his old room and looked at the photographs on the wall. He had returned to his own house, slept in his own bed, and spoken to his own mother. Yet he was still a guest. Atlas approached a tall cabinet near the wall and lifted his nose. On the top shelf, partly hidden behind an old framed photograph, rested a brand-new basketball. Elias stared at it. It was the exact model he had begged Margaret to buy before his final deployment. He reached toward it but stopped before touching it. Downstairs, Margaret's knitting needles clicked steadily in the silence. The room had been waiting for him, and so had the gift she had never been able to give. The basketball remained on the top shelf through the night, untouched but impossible for Elias to ignore. From the narrow bed beneath the window, he could see its curved orange surface above the framed photographs, still clean despite the dust that had settled over nearly everything else in the room. Someone had wiped it regularly. Margaret had not simply stored the ball and forgotten it. She had cared for it, year after year, as though keeping the gift ready might somehow keep the person meant to receive it alive. Elias slept in short intervals. Each time the farmhouse creaked, his eyes opened automatically. Years in hostile territory had taught his body to wake before his mind understood the danger. Yet the sounds here were not gunfire, distant engines, or boots outside a hidden shelter. They were the settling boards of his childhood home, the soft wind against the window, and Atlas breathing steadily on the floor beside the bed. At dawn, Elias rose, straightened his green digital camouflage uniform, and stepped into the hallway. Atlas followed, the tan tactical vest fitted across the Belgian Malinois' lean mahogany body. The dog paused at the bedroom door and looked back toward the cabinet. Leave it, Elias whispered. Atlas obeyed, but his dark amber eyes lingered on the ball. Downstairs, Margaret stood at the stove preparing oatmeal. Her faded blue-gray dress brushed the floor, and the cream shawl rested over her narrow shoulders. She appeared tired, but her movements followed an old rhythm. Stir 3 times. Tap the spoon against the pot, lower the flame, then reach for cinnamon without looking. Elias remembered watching the same routine before school. Margaret glanced at him. You walk too quietly. Habit. Bad habit in a house with an old woman. I'll try to make more noise. Not too much. Elias almost smiled. Understood. She placed a bowl on the table for him, then another for herself. Atlas sat beside the kitchen doorway without being told. Margaret looked toward the dog. He has already eaten. Yes. He looks hungry. He always looks hungry when someone else has food. Margaret cut a small piece from her toast and set it on the edge of the table. Elias raised an eyebrow. I thought you said he was not to be fed inside. I said you were not to feed him inside. Atlas waited until Margaret nodded before taking the toast gently from her fingers. You trained him well, she said. He trained me too. Margaret studied Elias for a moment, as if the answer belonged to someone else she once knew. Then she lowered her gaze to her oatmeal. The morning passed quietly. Elias replaced rotten boards along the rear porch, while Margaret sorted jars in the pantry. Every hour, Atlas moved between them, checking on Margaret before returning to Elias. The dog's repeated visits seemed to reassure her. She had begun speaking to him when she believed Elias was too far away to hear. You stay out of the flower bed. Atlas sat beside the flower bed. That is not the same as staying out. Atlas moved 2 feet away. Margaret nodded approvingly. Better. Near noon, she called Elias inside. The shelves in the sitting room need cleaning. I cannot reach the top anymore. Elias followed her to the cabinet where the basketball rested. His chest tightened as Margaret handed him a folded cloth. Only dust, she warned. Do not rearrange anything. Yes, Mom. He began with the framed photographs. One showed Margaret and Elias at a county fair when he was 11. In another, his father stood beside the original tractor, smiling beneath a sun-faded cap. A military photograph showed Elias's first SEAL team lined up against a gray training wall. Margaret watched him handle each frame. You are careful. These things matter to you. They belong to my family. Elias reached the top shelf. His fingers closed around the basketball. The moment he lifted it, Margaret's breath caught. Put that down. Her voice was not loud, but the panic in it froze him. Elias lowered the ball carefully. I was only cleaning beneath it. I said, put it down. Margaret crossed the room faster than he had seen her move before and took the ball from his hands. Her thin arms wrapped around it protectively. I'm sorry, Elias said. You had no right. You asked me to clean the shelf. I should have asked before touching it. Margaret held the ball against her chest. Her fingers trembled over the black seams. This is not some old thing for you to move around. I understand. No, you don't. She turned away, but Elias saw tears gathering in her faded eyes. He placed the cloth on the table and sat in the chair opposite her, leaving several feet between them. Margaret stared at the basketball. My son wanted one like this when he was young. Not just any ball. This exact model. A faint, broken smile appeared. He had seen it in the sporting goods window for months. Every time we passed, he pretended not to look. Elias remembered that window. He remembered slowing down each time they walked past, hoping Margaret would not notice. I could not afford it then, she continued. The roof was leaking, the tractor needed a new belt, and there were medical bills from his father. So I told him it was foolish to spend so much on a ball. Elias swallowed. Margaret traced the manufacturer's mark. Years later, before his final deployment, I saw one in a store. I bought it with money I had saved from mending dresses. I thought I would place it on his bed for his birthday. You never gave it to him? He left 3 days early. Her voice cracked. He said the mission had changed. He promised he would be home before the first snow. Margaret looked toward the window, though there was no snow beyond it. I kept the ball for when he returned. Elias lowered his eyes. Then 2 officers came to the door. The room became very still. They carried a folded flag. One of them was younger than my son. He kept looking at the floor because he could not look at me. They said Elias had died with honor. Margaret's hands tightened around the ball. I hated that word. Elias looked up. Honor? What use is honor to a mother standing in an empty house? Tears rolled down her face. They said I should be proud. I was proud, but pride did not close the door at night. Pride did not sit at the kitchen table. Pride did not call me on Sundays. Elias's own vision blurred. He wanted to cross the room, kneel before her, and tell her she had never truly lost him. But Clara's warning remained clear. Emotional truth could still become pressure if Margaret was not ready to receive it. He reached for the box of tissues and placed it on the table between them. I'm sorry, he said. For touching the ball, for all the years she had to wait. Margaret looked at him sharply. You speak as though you knew her. Elias realized his mistake. I meant you. No, you said she. He could not answer without stepping across the boundary Samuel and Clara had helped create. Margaret searched his face, then looked down. My son used to do that. Do what? Choose his words too carefully when he was afraid of telling me something. Elias felt his pulse quicken, but Margaret's attention returned to the basketball. I bought this for him, she whispered, and now he will never hold it. Elias kept his voice gentle. Maybe he knew you wanted to give him something. How could he know? Children know when their mother loves them, even when the gift never reaches their hands. Margaret stared at him for a long time. You talk like him. Elias's chest tightened. Perhaps he learned from you. She did not tell him to leave. Instead, she placed the basketball back on the shelf herself. Her hand remained on it for several seconds before she stepped away. That afternoon, Atlas disappeared from the porch. Elias found him sitting beneath the old maple tree behind the barn, staring at a patch of disturbed earth. The dog pawed once at the ground, then looked toward Margaret, who had followed them outside. What is there? She asked. Elias knelt and cleared away leaves. Beneath the soil was a rusted metal tin. Margaret gasped before he opened it. My son buried that. Inside lay a child's blue marble, a broken sheriff's badge from a toy set, and a folded piece of paper sealed inside waxed cloth. The handwriting belonged to a 10-year-old Elias. If I go far away, this is where Mom can find my treasure. Margaret took the note with both hands. Her lips moved over the words. Atlas sat beside her, tail still. For one suspended moment, the years seemed to fold together. Margaret looked from the childish handwriting to the adult man kneeling in the dirt. Why would the dog know where this was? Elias looked at Atlas. He had no logical answer. The dog had never lived at Rowan Farm as a puppy. Perhaps he had followed the scent of rust, disturbed soil, or a small animal. Perhaps chance had simply opened a door, memory had kept closed. Margaret pressed the note to her chest. My son always believed hidden things wanted to be found. The discovery changed the rhythm of the house. Margaret did not suddenly recognize Elias, but she became less guarded. That evening, she invited him to sit at the kitchen table while she prepared vegetable soup. She handed him a knife and asked him to cut carrots. Not too thick, she said. Elias sliced one. Too thick. He cut another. Still too thick. You could demonstrate. Margaret took the knife and made 3 perfect slices. Like that, Elias copied her. Better. The exchange felt so ordinary that it hurt more than the confrontation at the door. For 20 minutes, Elias was not a soldier returning from the dead or a stranger renting a room. He was simply a son being corrected by his mother. Margaret added thyme to the pot. My Elias hated onions. I remember. I mean, many people do. He used to remove them one by one and line them along the edge of his bowl. At dinner, Elias found himself doing exactly that without thinking. Margaret noticed. Neither of them spoke about it. The next morning, Samuel arrived with a folder of notices from Blackridge. Margaret refused to look at them and left the room. Elias examined the documents after receiving Samuel's permission to make copies. The amounts did not make sense. The original repair loan had been modest, but the balance had nearly tripled through service charges, inspection fees, delinquency penalties, and unexplained legal costs. One document claimed the entire farm had been used as collateral. I never saw that language in the original papers, Samuel said. Who reviewed them? A local attorney helped with the first loan. He retired before Blackridge purchased it. Elias looked at the signatures. Margaret's name appeared at the bottom of a later amendment, but the writing lacked the strong rightward slant he remembered from her letters. This isn't her signature. Samuel adjusted his glasses. I suspected as much. Suspicion is not enough. He recommended a legal aid attorney who specialized in elder financial exploitation. That afternoon, Elias drove into town to meet Maya Chen, a 37-year-old Asian-American attorney with a slim, confident build, a refined, angular face, fair skin, and focused dark brown eyes. Her straight black hair ended at her chin, framing an expression that was composed without being cold. She wore a fitted charcoal gray business suit, a buttoned white blouse, and plain black low-heeled shoes. A structured brown leather briefcase rested beside her chair. Maya had spent the first years of her career representing banks, but she left after discovering that one client had concealed abusive lending practices against elderly borrowers. Since then, she had developed little patience for polished paperwork, designed to hide cruelty. Maya studied the copies. The original loan appears valid, she said. This amendment is the problem. She was hospitalized around that time. Can you prove where she was on the date of signing? Samuel may have medical records. We will need authorization from Margaret or a lawful representative. We also need handwriting samples, the original contract, and information about the witness. Elias pointed to the collateral clause. They changed part of the property into the entire farm. If they did so knowingly, this is more than an unfair contract. Fraud? Potentially. But potential fraud and provable fraud are different things. Maya closed the folder. Do not confront Blackridge. Do not threaten anyone. Let the documents speak before anger destroys their value. Elias understood the warning. His uniform, training, and physical presence could easily be used to portray him as the aggressor. When he returned to the farm, Margaret was asleep in her chair. Atlas lay near her feet. A wooden box sat open on the table beside them. Inside were photographs, old receipts, and folded letters tied with blue ribbon. One envelope bore Elias's name. It had never been mailed. He did not touch it until Margaret opened her eyes. You may read that one, she said. Elias carefully unfolded the paper. My dear Elias, everyone says you are gone, but I still leave the porch light on. A mother does not need proof to wait for her child. If there is any road left between us, follow the light home. Elias read the words twice when he looked up. Margaret was watching him. I wrote it after the funeral, she said. I had nowhere to send it. Elias pressed the letter carefully against the table so his shaking hands would not tear it. You were right to keep the light on. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? because some roads take longer than anyone expects. Before she could question him further, a car door slammed outside. Samuel entered, carrying a certified envelope. His face was pale. "Blackridge sent notice," he said. "They are coming in 3 days to complete the transfer." Margaret's fear returned immediately. Elias folded her letter and placed it back inside the envelope. The ball upstairs had waited 5 years. The porch light had burned through hundreds of empty nights. And now the men who believed Margaret was alone were coming to take the only place where her son could still find her. The certified notice from Blackridge remained unopened on the kitchen table for nearly an hour. Margaret would not touch it. She stood at the sink with both hands braced against the counter, staring through the window toward the fields as if the envelope itself had already become a group of men walking up the road. Elias watched from the doorway, resisting the urge to tear the paper open, and promised that no one would take the farm. Promises had to be supported by more than anger now. Samuel Reed finally broke the seal. The notice stated that Blackridge Financial Services intended to conduct a final property review in 3 days and obtain Margaret's signature on a voluntary transfer agreement. If she refused, the company claimed it would begin immediate enforcement remedies under the disputed loan amendment. "They want to frighten her into signing before anyone can challenge the paperwork," Elias said. Samuel adjusted his glasses. "Can they take the farm in 3 days?" "Not legally," Maya Chen answered over the phone. "But they can arrive, act as though the outcome is settled, and pressure her into creating a document they can use later." Elias looked toward Margaret. "What do we do?" "First, you do not threaten them," Maya said. "Second, Margaret signs nothing. Third, I need evidence showing that Blackridge knew the amendment was false." Elias's jaw tightened. "You already have the hospital dates and the signature comparison. That proves the document is suspicious. It does not yet prove who created it or whether the company knowingly relied on a forgery." "Someone side knows." "Yes," Maya said, "and I may have found him." The next morning, Elias drove to an aging commercial district on the southern edge of Raven Creek. Atlas sat beside him, his upright ears turning toward each passing vehicle. Maya had arranged a meeting in a quiet diner that opened before sunrise and rarely filled until lunch. The man waiting in the rear booth was Nolan Price, a 55-year-old former corporate accountant with a slightly thin, stooped build and the posture of someone accustomed to making himself smaller in crowded rooms. His face was pale and tired, with hollow cheeks, thinning gray-brown hair, and light blue eyes that rarely stayed on another person for more than a few seconds. Thin-framed prescription glasses sat low on his nose. He wore a pale blue button-up shirt beneath a muted brown-gray office jacket, dark gray trousers, and plain brown leather shoes polished more from habit than confidence. Nolan had spent 28 years balancing numbers for other people. That work had made him precise, cautious, and deeply afraid of mistakes. It had also taught him how easily cruelty could be hidden inside neat columns and professional language. Maya sat opposite him in her charcoal gray suit, a legal pad open beside a cup of untouched coffee. Nolan glanced at Elias's green digital camouflage uniform, then at Atlas. "I was told this would be private." "It is," Maya said. "Mr. Rowan is directly affected by the documents we discussed." Nolan's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. "I should not be here. You asked to meet," Maya reminded him. "I asked a question. That is different." Elias took the seat beside Maya. Atlas lay under the table, calm but attentive. "What question?" Elias asked. Nolan looked down. "Whether Blackridge could be stopped without my name becoming public." Maya did not soften the truth. "If your records are authentic, they may support an injunction and a criminal investigation. But if the case proceeds, your testimony could eventually be required." Nolan shook his head. "You do not understand what those people do to anyone who becomes inconvenient." Elias studied him. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly. They never threatened directly." Nolan pushed his glasses higher. "They remove health coverage. They call new employers. They file complaints. They make a person spend 2 years proving something that should never have been questioned." "Why did you leave?" Nolan's eyes shifted toward the window. "Because a man named Arthur Bell lost his house." The words came slowly. Arthur Bell had been a 79-year-old widower who borrowed money to replace a collapsed septic system. Blackridge purchased the loan, then attached inspection fees, legal costs, and a property maintenance charge for grass Arthur had already cut himself. When he disputed the balance, a new amendment appeared, claiming his entire property secured the debt. I saw the amendment before it entered the system, Nolan said. The signature field was blank. What happened next? Maya asked. 2 days later, it contained his signature. You reported it? Nolan swallowed. I asked my supervisor. That was not my question. No, his answer barely carried across the table. Arthur was removed from his home 4 months later. He died in temporary housing before his appeal could be heard. Nolan stared into his coffee. I told myself I had a family, a mortgage, a daughter in college. I told myself one accountant could not fight an entire company. And now? Elias asked. Now my daughter no longer speaks to me. Nolan's face tightened. She found copies of the files after I resigned. She asked why I had kept them if I never intended to help anyone. I had no answer. Elias understood the shape of guilt. It did not always begin with what a person had done. Sometimes it began with the moment a person had chosen not to act. Maya leaned forward. You mentioned internal emails. Nolan looked toward Atlas, whose dark amber eyes remained fixed on him. The company called the program Asset Recovery Optimization. We called it the widow list. Elias's expression hardened. They targeted widows, widowers, people over 70, borrowers with recent hospital stays, anyone without adult children living nearby. Maya's pen stopped. How did they obtain medical information? Sometimes from public filings, sometimes from collection calls. Sometimes the borrower told an employee without realizing how the information would be used. Nolan opened his jacket but hesitated before reaching inside. Atlas raised his head. The accountant froze. He is not going to hurt you, Elias said. I know. Then, what are you afraid of? Nolan looked at Elias for the first time without immediately turning away. That if I hand this over, I can never pretend I was only following numbers. He removed a small encrypted storage drive and placed it on the table. Maya did not touch it yet. What is on it? Emails, fee schedules, internal account notes, and training documents. There are also scans showing changes made to loan amendments after the borrowers signed earlier versions. Margaret Rowan? Nolan nodded. Her account was flagged after the hospital reported a payment delay. The internal note says she was cognitively vulnerable and emotionally attached to the property because of a deceased military son. Elias's hand closed into a fist beneath the table. Maya noticed. Elias. He opened his hand. Nolan continued. They believe that made her easier to pressure. Who authorized the amended collateral? Maya asked. A regional director. Gordon Pike handled the field collection. The name meant nothing to Elias yet, but the hatred it created arrived instantly. Atlas suddenly rose beneath the table and placed his nose against Nolan's jacket pocket. Nolan pulled back, startled, then reached inside and removed a folded photograph. It showed a young woman in a graduation gown standing beside him, both smiling awkwardly into the sun. My daughter, Nolan said. Atlas sniffed the photograph, then rested his chin on Nolan's knee. The accountant's face broke. She used to bring injured animals home when she was a child. She believed anything frightened could be saved if someone stayed long enough. Nolan placed one trembling hand on Atlas's head. I taught her to believe that, he whispered. Then I became the kind of man who walked away. Elias looked at him. You are still sitting here. Nolan closed his eyes. For the first time that morning, he seemed less afraid of Blackridge than of remaining the person he had become. Use my name, he said to Maya. If you need it, use it. The meeting ended with a formal plan. Maya would create a documented copy of the drive, verify its metadata, and contact the county prosecutor. Nolan would sign a statement describing how the records were obtained and preserved. Until an injunction was filed, no one would alert Blackridge that an internal witness had come forward. On the drive back to the farm, Elias felt a familiar pressure building behind his ribs. It was the urge to act before procedure caught up with danger. In Kandar, hesitation could cost lives. Here, a careless confrontation could destroy the very case meant to protect Margaret. Maya called before he reached the farm. I reviewed enough to confirm the material is significant. Can you stop them from coming? I can request emergency relief. I cannot guarantee a judge will review it before their visit. Then they still come to the house. Yes, I can keep them out. Physically? Elias said nothing. That is exactly what they will want, Maya continued. A decorated serviceman threatening company employees on camera. They will say Margaret is being controlled by a stranger. Do not give them that story. They are trying to steal my mother's home. Then beat them with evidence, not rage. The sentence stayed with him after the call ended. When Elias entered the farmhouse, Margaret was sitting beneath the stopped clock with a folded blanket in her lap. Atlas crossed the room to her first. She rested one hand on the dog's head without looking down. "Did you find someone to help?" she asked. "We found a person who kept records. Will records stop them?" "They might." Margaret's mouth tightened. Might is what people say when they do not want to promise. Elias sat in the chair across from her. "I do not want to lie to you. Most people do. I know." She studied his face. "My son hated liars. What did he do when someone lied?" "He gave them one chance to correct it." A faint memory of her old rule returned to Elias. A lie left overnight grew roots. "Then Blackridge has had too many chances," he said. Margaret looked toward the window. "Do you have a mother?" Elias's breath caught. "Yes. Is she alive?" "Yes. Does she know where you are?" He could have answered truthfully in several ways, yet none felt safe. "She knows I am close." Margaret turned to him. "You should go see her." "I am trying." Her eyes remained on him, puzzled by the weight in his voice. That evening, she allowed him to replace the dead bulb above the porch. Elias climbed the short ladder while Margaret held it from below, despite his insistence that she sit down. When the new light came on, warm gold spread across the weathered boards. Margaret stared at it. "I kept that light on for Elias. I know." "How?" "You told me in the letter." She nodded, but the explanation did not fully satisfy her. "My boy was afraid of the dark when he was little," she said. "He used to come into my room and pretend he only wanted water." Elias smiled despite himself. Perhaps he did want water. No. He always forgot the glass. For a moment, she smiled back. Later that night, rain began tapping against the windows. Elias woke to footsteps in the hallway. Atlas was already standing beside the bedroom door. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, her cream shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face looked pale and disoriented. "Elias?" He stepped into the hall. "Yes." Relief spread across her face so quickly it left him unable to move. "You came home." Elias's heart seemed to stop. Margaret reached toward him. Then her eyes shifted to the adult face, the uniform, and the scars. Confusion replaced relief. She withdrew her hand. "What are you doing up here?" The memory had vanished as suddenly as it appeared. "I heard someone walking," Elias said carefully. "I was looking for my son." He lowered his voice. "I hope you find him." Margaret looked at him for several seconds, then returned to her room. Elias remained in the hallway long after her door closed. Atlas pressed against his leg. The next morning, Maya called with news that the emergency filing had been prepared, but the assigned judge would not review it until later that day. "They may still arrive before we have an order," she warned. Elias looked through the kitchen window toward the road. Margaret was outside with Atlas, slowly gathering dry herbs into her wicker basket. The dog stayed close to her left side. For the first time, the image resembled a life that might still be repaired. Then a black sedan turned through the broken gate. It moved slowly along the moss-covered brick path and stopped in front of the house. 3 men stepped out. The man in front was tall and slightly heavy, wearing a dark charcoal overcoat over a black suit. His broad, square face was clean-shaven, his dark gray hair slicked neatly back, and his cold gray eyes scanned the property with the detached interest of someone already deciding what it would be worth without the people living there. Elias did not need an introduction. Gordon Pike had arrived. The black sedan stopped at the edge of the moss-covered brick path, its polished surface reflecting the broken fence and the gray morning sky. Gordon Pike stepped out first. At 52, he was tall and slightly heavy, with a broad square face, slicked back dark gray hair, and cold gray eyes that assessed the farm without warmth or curiosity. His clean-shaven face carried a controlled professional smile, the kind designed to appear reasonable while leaving no room for disagreement. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a complete black suit, white shirt, dark red tie, and polished black shoes that avoided every patch of mud. 2 Blackridge employees followed him. One was a narrow-faced man in his 30s carrying a leather document case. The other was a broad-shouldered field assessor with cropped blonde hair, a dark raincoat, and the restless posture of someone accustomed to intimidating people without saying anything directly. Margaret stood near the herb garden with her wicker basket hanging from one arm. Atlas immediately moved closer to her left side. The Belgian Malinois did not growl, but his upright ears locked forward, and his lean mahogany body became still beneath the tan tactical vest. Elias walked out of the farmhouse. Gordon's eyes moved over the green digital camouflage uniform and then settled on Elias's face. "You must be the tenant." "My name is Elias Rowan." A faint change passed through Gordon's expression. Nolan's records had likely mentioned the dead son's name. "Interesting choice," Gordon said. "Mrs. Rowan, We are here to discuss the voluntary transfer outlined in our notice. Margaret gripped the basket. I told your company I am not selling. This is not a sale. Gordon's voice remained smooth. It is an orderly resolution of an unpaid secured obligation. Elias stepped between Margaret and the three men without blocking the path entirely. Her attorney instructed Blackridge to direct all communication through her office. No attorney has filed a valid appearance in the collection matter. That does not give you permission to pressure a vulnerable borrower at her home. Gordon smiled as if Elias had confirmed something useful. And what authority do you have? I live here, as a tenant. Yes. Then you have no legal interest in this property. Margaret looked from one man to the other, confusion tightening her face. Gordon noticed. He opened his leather folder and softened his tone. Mrs. Rowan, no one wants to upset you. We are trying to prevent a more difficult process. If this matter proceeds, the sheriff may eventually be required to remove you. That is misleading, Elias said. Gordon ignored him. You can sign a voluntary agreement today. Blackridge will allow you 30 days to relocate and may even assist with temporary housing. Margaret stared at the papers. You said before that I could stay until winter. That option expired. You said the debt was only on the northern field. The amended agreement includes the full parcel. I never agreed to that. Gordon turned one page toward her. Your signature is here. Margaret looked at the handwriting and began breathing more quickly. Elias took out his phone, activated the recording function, and placed it visibly on the porch railing. For clarity, this conversation is being recorded. The narrow-faced employee shifted uneasily. Gordon's smile disappeared. You do not have consent from every party. This state permits a participant in the conversation to record it, Elias replied. I am informing you as a courtesy. He had confirmed that detail with Maya that morning. Gordon closed the folder halfway. You appear determined to complicate a matter that does not concern you. It concerns the woman you are trying to frighten. Margaret touched Elias's sleeve. Are they taking the house? Not today, Elias said. No one can lawfully remove you today. Gordon looked directly at her. He cannot promise that. In fact, Mrs. Rowan, you should ask yourself why a heavily trained military man suddenly appeared in your home just as your property became available. Elias felt anger move through him, quick and hot. Gordon continued. He admits he is only a tenant, yet he speaks for you, controls your visitors, and has placed himself between you and your creditors. Has he asked to be added to your deed? No, Margaret whispered. Has he told you who he really is? Elias's jaw tightened. Margaret looked at him, fear and uncertainty returning. Gordon had found the wound and pressed directly into it. He says his name is Elias, she said. Your deceased son's name, Gordon replied. That should concern you. Atlas released a low sound. Quiet, Elias said. The dog obeyed, but his gaze never left Gordon. Elias reminded himself of Maya's warning. Blackridge wanted anger. Gordon wanted footage of a uniformed man losing control. Every insult was bait. You have been notified that the document is disputed, Elias said. Leave a copy and communicate with counsel. Gordon nodded toward the narrow-faced employee. The man opened the document case and removed a second packet. This is not the same document you sent, Elias said. It is an updated acknowledgement. An acknowledgement of what? That Mrs. Rowan received notice and declined voluntary resolution. The employee stepped toward Margaret with a pen. Just sign here to confirm delivery. Margaret backed away. I do not want to sign anything. It does not transfer ownership, the employee said. Then she does not need to sign it, Elias replied. Gordon's tone sharpened. Stand aside. No. The broad-shouldered assessor moved closer, positioning himself just behind the employee. Elias saw the tactic immediately. Create physical pressure without openly touching Margaret. Atlas moved in front of her. The employee stopped. Control your dog. He is controlled. The Malinois stood steady, head level and body balanced. He did not bare his teeth or lunge. He simply occupied the space between Margaret and the approaching man. Gordon looked towards Elias's phone. You understand that an aggressive animal could be removed from the property. Atlas has not approached you. Your employee approached Margaret after she refused to sign. The recording captured every word. A vehicle engine sounded beyond the gate. Samuel's old truck appeared on the road with Clara sitting beside him. Gordon glanced toward it, then checked his watch. The pressure in his expression changed. He had expected a frightened elderly woman alone with a tenant. More witnesses were arriving. Mrs. Rowan, he said, stepping closer, we can end this simply. Sign the acknowledgement and we will leave. I said no. The narrow-faced employee extended the pen again. Margaret's basket slipped from her arm. Glass jars struck the ground, one breaking beside her shoes. She flinched at the sound and stepped backward. Her heel caught the raised edge of the porch rug. Elias saw her balance fail. "Mom!" He moved instantly. He caught her shoulder and upper back before her full weight hit the floor, but the side of her head still struck the wooden boards with a dull sound. The world narrowed. Elias dropped to his knees and supported her neck without moving her unnecessarily. "Margaret, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened halfway. Atlas stood over her legs, whining softly. Clara ran from Samuel's truck, medical bag in hand. Her navy scrubs and gray clinical jacket moved through the broken gate as Samuel followed as quickly as his injured hip allowed. "Do not lift her," Clara ordered. Elias kept one hand beneath Margaret's shoulder. "I caught most of the fall." Her head struck the floor. Clara knelt, checked Margaret's pupils, and asked her name. Margaret did not answer. Through her blurred vision, the adult man kneeling above her seemed to disappear. In his place stood a 17-year-old boy in a faded school jacket, his thin shoulders squared in front of two angry men who had come to take the family tractor after his father's death. Margaret remembered rain striking the windows that night. She remembered young Elias spreading his arms and saying, "No one threatens my mother in this house." The image shifted. The schoolboy's narrow back became the broad, steady back of the man now shielding her from Gordon Pike. Margaret's eyes moved to his right hand where it supported her shoulder. The pale scar beneath his thumb caught the light. A kitchen window breaking. A 12-year-old boy trying not to cry. A dish towel wrapped around his bleeding hand. Dirty shoes on a clean floor. A milk bottle left open. A basketball in a store window. A white handkerchief marked with a blue E. The images no longer appeared separately. For one fragile moment, they touched. Margaret lifted her trembling hand toward Elias's face. "Ellie." Then her arm fell and her eyes closed. Elias's breath stopped. "Margaret?" Clara pressed two fingers against the side of her neck. "She has a pulse." "Samuel, call emergency services now." Samuel already had his phone out. Gordon took a step back. "We should leave these people to handle the medical situation. No one leaves yet," a voice called from the path. Maya Chen entered through the gate beside a county investigator and two uniformed sheriff's deputies. Maya still wore her charcoal gray suit, but her black hair had been disturbed by the wind and a thick court folder was tucked beneath one arm. The investigator was Daniel Harlow, a 46-year-old man with a compact build, a lined rectangular face, short sandy brown hair, and a close-trimmed mustache. He wore a plain navy jacket over a pale shirt and carried himself with the restrained patience of someone who preferred documents to confrontation. Years investigating financial crimes had taught him that respectable clothing often concealed more damage than obvious weapons. Maya looked at Margaret, then at Clara. "Is she conscious?" "Not now," Clara answered. "The ambulance is coming." Maya turned to Gordon. "The court issued a temporary restraining order 15 minutes ago. Blackridge is prohibited from seeking any signature, acknowledgement, transfer, or access to the Rowan property until the disputed loan is reviewed." Gordon regained his professional tone. "We had not been served. You have now." Maya handed him a stamped copy. Gordon looked at the investigator. This was a routine delivery. Daniel Harlow gestured toward the packet in the employee's hand. "I would like to see the document you asked Mrs. Rowan to sign. It is privileged company material. It was presented to a borrower during an active fraud inquiry. You may hand it over voluntarily, or I can secure the premises while obtaining the necessary warrant." The narrow-faced employee looked at Gordon. Gordon's eyes hardened. "Give him the acknowledgement." Daniel examined the first page, then compared it with a copy Maya removed from her folder. "These versions do not match. It was updated. The signature on the attached authorization does not match the signature samples already submitted," Maya said. Gordon turned toward her. "You are making conclusions without an expert." "No, I am identifying a reason for further examination." Daniel placed the packet inside an evidence sleeve. One deputy spoke quietly with Elias and confirmed that the phone recording had captured the interaction. Elias handed over the device only after Daniel explained how a forensic copy would be made while preserving the original. The ambulance arrived moments later. Paramedics secured Margaret's neck, transferred her to a stretcher, and carried her toward the vehicle. Elias walked beside them until Clara touched his arm. "You can ride with her." He looked back at Atlas. Samuel took the dog's collar. "I will bring him." Elias climbed into the ambulance. Through the open rear doors, he saw Gordon and his employees speaking with the investigator, They were not placed in handcuffs. Not yet. Gordon was being detained long enough to identify him, secure the disputed document, and arrange a formal interview. That was how justice worked here, slower than combat, dependent on paper, patience, and proof. The doors closed. At the hospital, doctors took Margaret for imaging. Elias sat in the waiting area with his hands locked together. The blood on one cuff of his uniform came from a small cut near Margaret's hairline. He stared at it until Samuel arrived with Atlas. The dog pressed against Elias's knees. Maya entered 20 minutes later. "The restraining order is active," she said. "The farm is protected for now. The investigator also has the new document, your recording, and statements from Clara and Samuel. Will Gordon be arrested? Not tonight merely for appearing or presenting disputed paperwork, but the evidence Nolan provided, combined with today's document, may support charges after review." Elias looked toward the treatment doors. "She said my name." Maya's legal composure softened. "Did she recognize you?" "I do not know." A doctor approached them. He explained that Margaret had a mild concussion and a small cut requiring stitches. Initial scans showed no major bleeding, but because of her age, heart history, and cognitive condition, she would remain under observation. "Will the fall restore her memory?" Elias asked. The doctor shook his head. "Head trauma is not a treatment for memory loss. It may temporarily worsen confusion. Any recognition she showed could have come from emotional cues already accumulating before the fall." The answer hurt, but it was honest. Elias entered Margaret's room after midnight. She lay still beneath a white blanket, her silver hair partly covering the bandage near her temple. He sat beside the bed. Atlas was not allowed into the room yet, so the dog waited outside with Samuel. Elias took Margaret's hand carefully. He no longer asked God to make her remember everything. That prayer seemed too demanding now. Instead, he whispered, "Let her wake without fear." Near dawn, Margaret's fingers moved in his hand. Her eyelids opened. She looked at the ceiling, then slowly turned toward Elias. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her gaze traveled over his face as though searching through years of broken images. Elias did not call her mom. He did not ask whether she knew him. He simply waited, terrified that the single syllable she had spoken on the porch had already disappeared. Margaret's eyes remained fixed on Elias as morning light slowly entered the hospital room. A white bandage covered the small wound near her temple, and exhaustion had deepened the lines across her pale face. Her silver-white hair lay loose against the pillow instead of being gathered into its usual low bun. She looked fragile beneath the hospital blanket, but the confusion in her faded blue-gray eyes was sharper than weakness. Elias sat beside the bed without moving. His green, digital camouflage uniform was wrinkled from the long night, and a faint brown stain remained on one cuff where he had held her after the fall. He had faced armed men with less fear than he felt beneath her silent examination. Margaret looked at his face, then at his right hand resting near hers. "Your hand," she whispered. Elias lowered his gaze toward the narrow scar beneath his thumb. "What about it?" "You broke the kitchen window." His breath caught. Margaret's eyes closed briefly. "You were 12. You lost the house key and thought climbing through the window would be easier than admitting it." Her voice remained uncertain, as though she were repeating words heard from far away. "The glass cut you. You tried to hide the blood behind your back." Elias could no longer keep his voice steady. "You wrapped my hand in a dish towel, a yellow towel. It had little blue flowers." Margaret opened her eyes again. For an instant, recognition appeared. Not the complete recognition Elias had dreamed about during every night in Canadar, but something smaller and more human, a narrow path through the fog. "Elias?" He bowed his head as tears reached his eyes. "Yes, Mom." Margaret raised one trembling hand and touched his clean-shaven cheek. Her fingers followed the edge of his jaw, searching for the younger face stored inside her memory. "My son was not this old." A broken laugh escaped Elias. "I took too long coming home." Her hand stopped. "They said you died." "I know. There were 2 officers." "I know. They gave me a flag." Elias covered her hand with his. "I am sorry you had to stand there alone." Margaret's expression shifted. The clarity began to weaken, replaced by fear. "Where were you?" "Trapped in the Kandar Valley. Atlas and some villagers kept me alive. I tried to come home." She stared at him as though the answer belonged to a story she could not fully enter. "Atlas? The dog." Margaret looked toward the closed door. "The dog with the dark face?" "Yes. He waited outside? All night." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then someone should let him in." Clara Mendez had already spoken to the hospital staff about arranging a brief visit. Because Atlas was a trained working dog accompanying a veteran and remained under strict control, the hospital approved a supervised exception. A few minutes later, Clara entered with Atlas beside her. The community nurse still wore her navy blue scrubs and light gray clinical jacket. Her black hair was tied low, though several strands had escaped after the long night. Fatigue showed beneath her dark brown eyes, but her calm manner remained unchanged. Atlas entered slowly. His tan tactical vest had been cleaned, and his deep fawn-to-mahogany coat reflected the morning light. The 5-year-old Belgian Malinois looked first at Elias, then at Margaret. He waited until Elias gave a small nod before approaching the bed. Margaret extended her hand. Atlas placed his muzzle against her palm. "He brought you home?" she asked. "He helped me survive long enough to find the road." Margaret stroked the black fur along his mask. "Then he is family." Atlas lowered himself beside the bed, resting his head near her hand. Margaret looked back at Elias. "I remember the shoes." "What shoes?" "The muddy ones you wore through my kitchen." A weak irritation entered her voice. "I told you 100 times to leave them at the door. Probably more than 100. "And the milk." Elias smiled through his tears. "I still forget the cap. You should have learned by now. I had a difficult childhood." Margaret's mouth curved into a small smile. Then the expression faded. "Are you the man renting my room?" The question entered the room gently but cut deep. Elias felt Clara watching him, ready to intervene if he reacted too strongly. He took a breath. "Yes, I rent the room upstairs." Margaret looked embarrassed. "I thought you said you were my son." "I am that too." Her confusion increased. "How can both things be true?" "Because I needed somewhere to stay while you learned to trust me." Margaret turned toward the window. "I forgot you. You did not choose to." "What kind of mother forgets her own child?" Elias leaned closer, careful not to crowd her. "The kind who survived something no mother should have been asked to survive." Tears formed in Margaret's eyes. "What happens when I forget again?" Elias had no reason to offer false certainty. The doctors had warned him that recognition might continue to appear and disappear. Some memories could strengthen. Others might never return. He answered with the only promise he knew he could keep. "Then I will introduce myself again." "Every time? Every time. What if I call you a stranger?" "I will be a kind stranger." "What if I tell you to leave?" "I will step outside, wait until you feel safe, and knock again." Margaret looked at him. "You would keep coming back?" Elias pressed her hand between both of his. "I crossed 5 years to get home. I can cross the porch as many times as you need." Atlas suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the window. The morning sun had reached the glass, casting a narrow bar of golden light across Margaret's blanket. The dog rose, followed the light to the edge of the bed, and placed one paw beside her hand. Margaret stared at the brightness and whispered words Elias had not heard since childhood. "Leave the porch light on." Elias froze. Margaret continued without looking at him. "He is afraid of coming home in the dark." The words were not addressed to the adult man beside her. They belonged to another night, another version of him. Perhaps the little boy who had stayed out too late, or the soldier she had waited for after the funeral. Yet the meaning was clear. Some part of Margaret had never stopped guiding him home. Elias looked toward Atlas. The dog's dark amber eyes remained steady. "I will leave it on," Elias promised. Margaret closed her eyes, still holding Atlas's paw beside her hand. She remained in the hospital for 3 days. Her concussion caused periods of increased confusion, but the scans continued to show no major bleeding. Doctors adjusted her medication and recommended closer supervision after discharge. Clara worked with Samuel to create a daily schedule, while Elias agreed to take responsibility for nights and emergencies. Margaret would remain involved in every decision she could understand, and no one would treat her illness as permission to silence her. When she returned to Rowan Farm, the temporary restraining order was still active. Gordon Pike and the 2 Blackridge employees were prohibited from contacting her directly. Maya Chen handled every document and call. The investigation did not end quickly. Daniel Harlow spent months comparing Blackridge's internal files with Nolan Price's copies. Forensic specialists confirmed that several loan amendments had been altered after earlier documents were signed. Hospital records showed Margaret had been receiving inpatient care on the date. Blackridge claimed she personally appeared before a witness. The employee listed as the independent witness had worked under Gordon's supervision. Nolan gave a sworn statement and later testified before a grand jury. His decision cost him professional contacts and brought public attention he had feared. but it also reopened cases involving other elderly property owners. His daughter did not immediately forgive him. She did, however, send a brief message saying she had seen the news and hoped he would finally finish what he had begun. Nearly 8 months after the confrontation at the farmhouse, prosecutors charged Gordon and 2 senior Blackridge executives with fraud, attempted theft through deception, conspiracy, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. Gordon denied wrongdoing and was not treated as guilty before trial. But the documents, recordings, witness statements, and digital records formed a case too substantial to dismiss. The civil court voided Margaret's disputed amendment. The original repair loan remained, but all fabricated charges and expanded collateral claims were removed. A victim assistance fund and a settlement negotiated by Maya cleared the remaining lawful balance. Rowan Farm belonged to Margaret again, without Blackridge's claim hanging over it. The victory did not restore the broken fences or revive the fields overnight. Elias began with what mattered most. He repaired the roof, replaced unsafe electrical wiring, and installed rails beside the stairs. Samuel selected seed suitable for the damaged soil. Clara labeled Margaret's medication and arranged a calendar with photographs to help orient her each morning. Maya prepared a limited power of attorney and property safeguards that preserved Margaret's rights while preventing anyone from pressuring her into private financial agreements. The people of Raven Creek came on a Saturday to help. Some remembered Elias as a boy. Others knew him only as the soldier who had returned from the dead. They raised new fence posts, cleared the irrigation ditch, repaired the barn doors, and repainted the weathered Rowan Farm sign. Elias did not replace everything. He kept the moss along the edges of the brick path because Margaret said it made the house look old in a respectable way. He repaired his father's clock, but left the small scratch in its wooden case. He kept the blue sofa, the knitting chair, and every photograph in his bedroom. The basketball remained on the shelf. Margaret's memory continued to shift. On good mornings, she called Elias by name before he entered the kitchen. On difficult mornings, she asked why a soldier was sleeping upstairs. Once, she accused him of stealing her son's boots. Elias removed them, placed them outside, and reintroduced himself over tea. He learned not to measure love by recognition. Sometimes Margaret could not remember their relationship, but she still saved the larger portion of supper for him. She still told him to button his uniform properly. She still checked the porch if he returned late from the fields. Her mind forgot. Her care remained. Nolan began volunteering twice a week at Maya's legal aid office, reviewing loan statements for elderly homeowners. Samuel returned to helping with animals around the farm, though he complained that Atlas ignored all veterinary advice. Clara continued her regular visits, gradually becoming less of a nurse and more of a trusted member of the household. Spring reached Raven Creek with steady rain. Green shoots appeared in fields that had seemed dead when Elias returned. The repaired windmill turned for the first time in years, creaking through its first rotation before gathering confidence in the wind. One warm afternoon, Margaret walked onto the porch holding the basketball. Elias was repairing a gate with Atlas lying nearby. He set down the tool when he saw her. Margaret held the ball toward him. "This belongs to my son." Elias approached slowly. "Yes, I bought it for his birthday. He would have loved it." She examined his face. "Are you Elias today?" His eyes filled. "Yes, Mom, I am Elias today." Margaret placed the basketball in his hands. "I am sorry the gift is late." Elias held the ball against his chest. "It is not late. I just took the long way home." Margaret looked across the renewed fields. Atlas rose and stood beside them, facing the same direction as Elias. "How long are you staying this time?" she asked. Elias looked at the house, the restored fence, the turning windmill, and the woman who might remember him for another hour or forget him before sunset. "I am not going anywhere." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good," she whispered. "A farm needs someone who remembers to close the milk." Elias laughed. That evening, Margaret forgot giving him the basketball. She asked why he was holding her son's gift. Elias placed it carefully back on the shelf and told her the story again. After she went to bed, he stepped outside with Atlas. The farm lay quiet beneath a dark blue sky. Elias reached above the door and switched on the porch light. Warm gold spread across the repaired boards and the old brick path. 5 years earlier, Margaret had kept that light burning so her missing son could find his way home. Now Elias kept it burning for her. Whenever Margaret became lost among broken memories, there would always be a familiar house, a patient dog, and a son ready to meet her at the door. Even if she forgot his name, he would remember hers. Even if she failed to recognize his face, he would recognize every version of her. And every morning she asked who he was, Elias Rowan would smile. Begin the story again, and come home one more time. Sometimes, God's miracles do not arrive as thunder from the sky or as an instant answer to every prayer. Sometimes a miracle is simply finding the strength to return, the patience to begin again, or the love to stay when someone we care about can no longer remember us. Elias could not restore every memory his mother had lost, but God gave him another chance to stand beside her. He learned that love is not measured by how often someone says our name. It is revealed in the way we forgive, protect, wait, and continue showing up even on the hardest days. In our own lives, we may know someone who is carrying grief, illness, loneliness, or a burden they cannot explain. A kind word, a phone call, a visit, or a few patient minutes may become the miracle that person has been praying for. Never underestimate what God can do through an ordinary act of love. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments which moment stayed with you the most, and where you are watching from. Subscribe to Navy SEAL and K9 Stories for more powerful stories about courage, loyalty, faith, and the unbreakable bond between people and their K9 companions. May God protect you, strengthen your family, guide you through every difficult road, and always leave a light on to lead you safely home.